Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the founding chair of the MA Curatorial Practice Program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York. Our program trains young curators for the professional field, and this is the first of the curatorial roundtables for the new year. And I'm really thrilled to have Michael Connor with us today to speak. Michael is co-executive director of Rhizome. At Rhizome, he's overseeing the NetArt Anthology Initiative, an effort to retell the history of NetArt through 100 works presented as an online exhibition, gallery exhibition, and a book. His first online curatorial project took place in 2003 at FACT in Liverpool, where he organized an edition of the traveling exhibition, Kingdom of Privacy. He's curated exhibitions and projects in Baku, Manchester, New York, Melbourne, Toronto, Mocha TV, and in London. And his writing has appeared in You Are Here, Art After the Internet, from Cornerstone, Abstract Video, The Moving Image in Contemporary Art, as well as in Art Asia Pacific and artforum.com. And I have it down that you're currently editing a book by Jean Youngblood about the work of Kit Galloway and Sherry Rabinowitz. Is that still the case?
Yes,
okay.
Still slowly the case.
All right, great. Okay, so for 60 minutes, the session is open to the public. About 45 to 50 minutes in, after Michael has given his presentation, we open the floor for questions from the audience. After that, this session becomes one just for our students, so I'll announce, please leave politely to the public. If you don't leave, I will less politely kick you out so that it is just for the students. Michael, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to have opportunities like this to kind of reflect on one's practice. And step out of the churn of ongoing curatorial work in order to take that opportunity to reflect. So I really appreciate that, and also I was really excited to be in conversation with other people who are developing their own practice and might have interesting perspectives and feedback on the topics I'm going to talk about. So I understand that these events are typically informal explorations of a curator's practice. I sort of prepared mine in a slightly hybrid way because I do have a formal talk that I sometimes give on the topic of curating online exhibitions, which is something that's been kind of a central concern in my career. But in hopes of avoiding reading a canned lecture and coming off as too stiff, I'm going to kind of highlight some concepts from it while sort of walking through some of my projects that relate to that topic. So hopefully that'll be like an illuminating way to like think about some of these issues through the work that I've done. I'm going to share my screen now. Yeah, so some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about are covered in two articles that I wrote for Rhizome. I'm just going to start by referring to those. The first is called Curating Online Exhibitions. It was envisaged as the first in a multi-part series. It took me more than a year to get the next part out. But I think the two parts kind of work together pretty well, though there is a third part which may one day also appear. But basically, that was an effort to kind of like set out a kind of methodology around curating online exhibitions, which has been kind of a concern in my career for kind of quite a long time because I really sort of got my start as a curator in the film festival world, working at a place called Cinema Texas in Austin, Texas. It was a really beautiful experimental program. And one of the things that made Cinema Texas exciting was that they were thinking about cinema in a rather expanded sense, at a moment where digital technology was obviously bringing changes to the way that artists were working and thinking about the screen and the moving image. Cinema Texas was sort of a place that really gathered together a whole network of curators from all over the world. One of the central people involved was a filmmaker named Athena Rahil Tsangari. And she'd really gathered this whole kind of network that was really special to be a part of. So I kind of moved from there to a more professionalized situation at an art center in Liverpool called FACT, Foundation for Art and Creative Technology, which is still going strong today, but it was just opening then as part of Liverpool's bid to become capital of culture, which is this kind of European Olympics for culture that cities use as a way of regenerating themselves. So in the at FACT, my first project as a capital R real professional curator was working with this group called Kingdom of Piracy, a curatorial platform developed by Shuli Cheng, Armin Madosh, and Yukiko Shikata. I'm sorry, there was a autocorrect mistake in Yukiko's name. So Kingdom of Piracy was an online project that was inspired by the concept of Creative Commons, of creating a cultural commons online through digital technology. And it was in particular taking inspiration from the ways in which piracy was a big driver of cultural exchange, particularly in the seas around Taiwan in the past. So it was kind of connecting like a cultural legacy of piracy that had brought information and knowledge into a cultural setting with digital exchanges that were happening. Kingdom of Piracy ran into trouble because of the WTO sort of shifted the climate for discussions of copying in Taiwan in the early 2000s. And so they kind of lost their funding and became this sort of free-floating project that would sort of turn up at different institutions. So what the image you see on the right is obviously the website where you had a range of different artist projects that were gathered. And so the challenge that I was facing as a curator was, how do I translate this into a kind of somewhat ad hoc physical space within the Arts Center? And of course, Shuli, she's an artist and she's a really, wonderfully imaginative person. And she had the concept of turning the space into a CD burning station. So she created a music sharing interface, and we filled the space with pirated CDs that we had purchased like on the street, basically for like, small amount of money, photos of these kind of ritualized destructions of CD burning. And then there were piles of blank CDs that you could use to burn your own kind of music mix within the space. It was like the celebration of music sharing as a driver of cultural exchange. So it was really interesting because I think, we obviously had photos in there, which are kind of traditional exhibition items. But the idea of bringing in a CD burning process really turned the space more into a kind of performative space where there was a process that was playing out that had to be facilitated and supported, and in which members of the public would participate. And that kind of idea of a process that plays out has been really, I think, a central way that I've approached curating digitally since that time. Another project that happened just a few years later was kind of a much more formalized project. This was the opening exhibition at BFI South Bank in 2007. The previous page showed a work from 2003. And this is an installation by the artist duo Jennifer and Kevin McCoy. And they were working in response to the setting of the British Film Institute. So the brief was to create an exhibition for the opening of a center dedicated to moving image. And they created these two sculptural installations, both of which recreated scenes from different moments in cinema that they had experienced together, and used sort of sculptural elements that were captured on live video cameras and fed to a nearby screen, a projection or flat screen on the right. So in each of these cases, there was a kind of video that was sort of playing, but the video that was playing was actually the result of this computer-based switcher that was switching among live images of cameras. If you walked past in the background, you might catch a glimpse of yourself within the video. So it turned the idea of like a pre-recorded setting into something that played out as a live process involving a computer, and still brought that process-based element in. The risk of doing things that are process-based always is there's quite a lot of technical exposure. And in this particular project, the artists came to install a little early. It was still a construction site when they installed, and they went home to give birth to their second child and were completely offline when an electrician did something bad to their computer and it completely fried. So the performative aspect of the installation meant that we were very reliant on this piece of technology running properly. And I learned quite a lot about reprogramming a basic stamp computer chip in that very stressful context. Quite a lot more formal than the FACT Media Lounge, but it all worked out. And now I work at Rhizome to kind of jump forward to the present, although I've been in my role at Rhizome since 2013, or in a role at Rhizome since 2013, and I've been involved since, really since my college days. But Rhizome is a really interesting place to explore some of these questions around the relationship of real and virtual and the way that the digital is structuring our everyday experience. It's this kind of online community that was founded in 1996 by an artist named Mark Tribe. And Mark was really responding to an upsurge in interest and conversations about how new tools could sort of bring changes to artistic practice. And he just wanted to kind of gather people in online conversation about it. So he created an email list where people could develop a shared language around these practices, share resources, share information, offer critique. And it was very lively, very successful. And Mark kind of had this experience of having started something that he wanted to continue, but not knowing what form it should take. And Rhizome kind of went through this interesting process of self-invention as a new digital institution, where it was a magazine, it was a commercial startup. And then very quickly after its founding, it was also, importantly, an archive. And that archival practice at Rhizome still exists today. We still maintain an archive of digital culture and try and think historically about this area of culture that's often considered to be ephemeral or easily lost. So we have this opportunity to kind of take a longer perspective on digital culture while also kind of retaining that spirit of the original organization, which is about community and about supporting new practice and supporting the development of practices that may not even be recognized as art by traditional institutions. So we have that kind of forward-facing and backward-facing look. And this is an example of what our website looked like back in 1996 at one point. But now Rhizome, since 2003, has been a partner of the New Museum of Contemporary Art in downtown New York. And so we maintain our status as an independent organization, but we have a partnership with the New Museum where we have kind of ongoing exchange of program ideas and resources, and we have the opportunity to work with the museum platform and to explore the ideas that we're championing in digital culture within that kind of space, and with the opportunity of reaching a larger audience in that way. So we have that unique status of being independent and small, but having a place within the museum world as well. I think that status really kind of came into focus when COVID lockdown began in 2020. We had been sort of functioning as this kind of niche organization in many ways, championing this area of art that was considered to be less important by many people in the art world. I think when the lockdown began, there was a sort of perspective shift that happened where museums were kind of rushing to put their exhibitions online. The internet was seen as this very important context for people to experience artwork. And there was a sort of discursive shift and a shift in priorities that began to take place. I don't think it was entirely positive in terms of resulting in really interesting online projects or anything, but there was a palpable and noticeable shift in people's readiness to consider the online context as a primary place for art. But as this shift was taking place, I began to sort of reflect on our experience in this field and think about, how we could make the past of online exhibitions a resource for this moment. In particular, it was difficult because, an online exhibition, especially when artists are involved, can be so many different things. It can be a crowdfunding campaign that results in art objects that get mailed to people's homes, or it can be a 3D simulation of a gallery in Manhattan where there's a lot of art on display. The number of things that have been described as online exhibition in the past is actually so varied, it becomes difficult to even define what an online exhibition is. So I wanted to bring in this element of my more formal lecture because I think it's kind of an interesting frame for thinking about some of the other issues that I've been dealing with as a curator. So in that moment of lockdown, I looked back at sort of museum studies definitions of exhibition. Now, as contemporary curators, you would probably already look at this as old-fashioned and outdated in certain ways, but I thought it was a useful referent, especially for a lot of the projects that we were seeing. They were kind of like a 3D scan of a gallery put online for people to access through their headset or something. So traditional museum studies of exhibition might look something like this. Exhibition involves imposition of order on objects brought into a particular space in a specific set of relations with one another. And I think what's striking about this is that each of these words really comes under pressure in an online context. You can begin with the word objects. These digital works are only objects in a metaphorical sense. They're really assemblages of many elements that have to work together to put a kind of process in motion. Or think about the word space. Is it the space of the screen? Is it the virtual space that's depicted on the screen? Is it the space that the computer user is in? Is it the space of the network where a social process is playing out? So the word space is also extremely fraught in the digital context. So in trying to kind of open up these terms, I decided to kind of rework it for the purposes of online exhibition. And I came up with online exhibition involves the performance of artworks and their objecthood in a particular mise en scène, brought into dynamic relationship with one another in a broader network context. I was trying to get at some of the ways that the exhibition of digital work, whether it's online or off, I believe, has some performative aspects. And so in thinking about that kind of exhibition, metaphors from theater and cinema tend to be helpful, especially if one can, understand the ways that they need to open up in relation to the digital. And this definition, so this is where I go back to talking about practice, but this definition is really rooted in the work that Rhizome did on the initiative Net Art Anthology, which I'll discuss in a little more detail. So I mentioned earlier that Rhizome has an archive. It's called the ArtBase. It holds more than 2,000 artworks, and it's been around since 1998. The ArtBase was a really radical concept at its founding. I think Mark really is owed a lot of credit for the way that it was set up. There are all these interesting concepts that are at play in it, one of which is that artists could have their work in the archive and retain control of it, which today is known as a post-custodial model. I don't believe that language had even been developed in the archives profession at the point where Mark did that. So it's a very radical archive. It's also very difficult to use the archive for many reasons to kind of educate people about the history of digital art. One of the primary reasons for that is that digital art, even when files are saved in a stable archive, it's very difficult to represent. And there's technical challenges that are involved, and the context changes so quickly that people might have a difficult time sort of understanding what they're even looking at without quite a lot of explanation. So the archive sort of on its own wasn't doing that job. And we really started Net Art Anthology as a way to offer a recontextualized view of 100 works. And through those 100 works to offer a new, revised, expanded, and deeper definition of what net art might be. to make the past of NetArt a resource for artists in the present. And our model in doing so was that, we understood each of the works in this series they were all going to be complicated. They were all going to involve technical items and complicated communities that all would require some unpacking. And so we decided to show the works one at a time over a period of 2 years so that each work could be presented, made available, and then sort of promoted on social media so that people could have a moment to kind of interact with and discuss it. So we actually started with a website that had 100 blank squares on it. And we sort of filled in the squares one at a time in a kind of like, as if we're sort of like unlocking content. The model, I think, was really successful in giving a narrative for people to follow along with. It was also like just a huge undertaking, very laborious process. I don't know if I exactly recommend it, but I think it did what we wanted it to do. But I want to talk about a couple of the things that kind of came up along the way in relation to thinking about curation as a sort of performance. I mean, I think the first one we can say is that the idea of like presenting things one at a time really makes the exhibition into something that has a real temporal quality. So there was definitely a sense of something playing out over a temporal arc, not just a spatial arrangement, but a temporal one. But even within the presentation of each individual work, there was quite a strong sense of the way that that we were enacting a performance. So one of the examples of what I mean by this can be seen in, in this work, The Web Stalker, which is a piece of software by an artist group called IOD. It was released in late 1997. And this work was released at a time when artists were really interested in making web browsers because Netscape Navigator and Internet Explorer were having this big war for control of the internet. And there was a very strong perception that whoever controlled the web browser controlled people's experience of online in a profound way. So as soon as artists watched this, they became very concerned with how they could modify that experience. If you make artwork and put it online, your work is then shown in a context that's kind of determined by Internet Explorer or Netscape Navigator. So this work in some ways could be considered like an archival win. It was something that still existed. We still had the original software in our archives. So it had been stored properly, it had not been lost. It was there on the shelf, ready to be arranged in our exhibition. But this particular piece of software posed real challenges. And I'm going to show you what we did and talk through what those challenges were as I show you. So the work was presented online in something called an emulator, which is a piece of software that imitates another piece of software. And the reason it was presented in this way is that it was software that could only run in the context of an operating system from 1997. So we actually, for each user that came to the site, we would spin up a version of Microsoft Windows 98 in the cloud, and we'd actually be remotely connecting to a Windows 98 computer in order to use the piece of software. So even though the software existed as an object, it couldn't perform its objecthood without another piece of context, which is Microsoft Windows 98. So there's already one way where that exhibition object is kind of under pressure because we have to expand the object's boundary outwards to include Windows 98. But because it was a web browser, there was another piece of context that was obviously very important, which was the websites that the browser would connect to. Now, this browser is very unusual to use. It's not going to look like a normal browser. When you open it, it would be a black field or a monochrome field. You could change the color. And part of the principle that the artist had in play was that instead of wanting to make the web like a magazine that was all about the way that pages were displayed with print and text next to each other, they felt this was like a retrograde way of using the web. They wanted people to understand the structure of the web and the way that websites were linked together. these artists said that's what's fundamental and what's important about this new medium is the way that there's interconnection among documents. So they made this web browser that totally de-emphasizes the experience of any individual page and instead shows you the links among pages. So it's almost impossible to like look at a normal web page. Like you can sort of see the text from it, but as you're browsing, it draws you kind of a map of the informatic space that you're moving through. So in order to access this map, you need to be accessing websites. And unfortunately, this web browser from 1997 can only access websites that use a protocol called HTTP 1.0, which, as you might imagine, is supported these days by very few websites in the world. So in order to present this work, we created like a little help document that users would see when they entered. And it would show you like basically the last 3 websites we could find that still used HTTP 1.0 with instructions of how to open the site. So the context that the piece required was not only Windows 98, it was also this kind of broader layer of obsolete websites that could still be accessed using it. When we have to make these kind of decisions in curating online work, or digital work even, we use the concept of the object boundary as part of our curatorial process and as part of the preservation discussions as well. And what we mean by that is that, there's no digital work that's like really truly a self-enclosed object in a perfect sense. But in order for it to be experienced by an audience, it needs to perform its objecthood. It needs to be made to kind of feel like a coherent item in some way. And so we have all these strategies for how we define what's included in that object and what's not included. And in the case of this work, we included in the performance of objecthood the original piece of software. We included 3 websites that ran this other system that was necessary for the work, and we included Windows 98. So that all became part of that performance of objecthood. Another work that was shown in NetArt Anthology is this work by Anne Hirsch called Scandalicious. And this is a work in which you can see the concept of the object boundary playing out in a different way. So Anne is a performance artist, kind of primarily, and she made this year-long performance in the kind of persona of a cam girl. So exploring questions of performance in the internet and how identity could be shaped through self-portrayal, self-representation in the emerging platforms of the time. And kind of thinking about questions of gender and how and how women's bodies were treated as commodity or as ways of building audience or community or exchange, many other kind of reflections on that. So Anne's project took place over the course of a year, and along the way, she built up a huge following. Let's say a very devoted following, and people would often send her videos in response to her work. So they might reenact it, or they might sort of tell her how great they thought it was, and some of it might be what we would, some of it was a little uncomfortable in terms of like Anne being a young woman and having all these interactions with older men online, but some of it was like also very sweet and normal. So that's an example of the fully recreated YouTube interface from the original era of YouTube that brings those response videos into dialogue with the original work.
All right, thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking with you all, and thank you for the opportunity.